Now, I want to read a chapter from a very interesting book. This book is called The Annals of the Disruption of 1843. And this is a book that I haven't read for about 20 years now, but I remember it extremely well and I remember enjoying reading it. It's The Annals of the Disruption, with extracts from the narratives of ministers who left the Scottish establishment in 1843. And it's by the Reverend Thomas Brown, DD. And this was published in 1893. And the reason I'm reading this is because of an interesting discussion which took place between Dr. Caris Mosley and Andrea Minichiello Williams and Tim Dieppe, which can be found on the Christian Concern YouTube page, during which they discussed the current lockdown and its effect on the church and its effect on worship. And the idea was put forward that perhaps within the guidelines given out by the government, it would be possible for some churches to meet in the open air and to do so that they weren't breaking any social distancing guidelines, and so that they could continue worship, which many of us are feeling is more and more important, that we get back to this as soon as we possibly can, and that the open air might be a solution. So my supplication is that this has been done before, and it happened at the time of the disruption in 1843 in Scotland. And although the circumstances then were very different, many churches were forced to meet in the open air until such times as they could both find land and build new churches to worship in. So I'm reading this chapter as a sort of talking point, as a sort of opportunity to consider how this worked out then, so that if there's a consideration of whether churches could in fact meet in the open air in the current time, that this might help us to understand some of the issues involved. I also note that in fact these are a tough people, and some of them met for several years in all weather. I think we're going to read even an account perhaps of a church that met below the high tide level on the seashore regularly, because there was nowhere in the parish where they could find land, and the landowners wouldn't let them worship on their land. So the only legal place they could worship together was actually below the high tide level when the tide was out. But as I say, I haven't read this chapter for 20 years or more, so I'm looking forward to reading it now and pray that it would be a blessing to us and a talking point. And again, I just have to give my thanks to God for Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. Some of you will be aware of my legal case, fighting the Department for Work and Pensions over my sacking on the transgender issue. And some of you also will be aware that the Christian Legal Centre have been the ones who've been supporting me and helping me in this. And the help that they've given me has not been small. So I thank God for that. And I encourage you to go and see some of their videos on their YouTube website, and perhaps particularly this one which was done last Friday about worship. So, Father, I pray that you bless this reading of this book, and I pray that something that happened in 1843, which at the time led to, in its own way, a tremendous revival of religion and showed the depth of the power of the gospel at work in the lives of so many people in the land of Scotland. Well, I pray, Lord, that you'd help us to understand the things that happened then, so that we might understand the things that we're facing today. And we pray that the worship of your name by the people of God meeting together might be re-established in this land and in lands throughout the world. And we pray, Father, that you'd help us to learn lessons from those who went before, who faced similar trials and difficulties, but for very different reasons. But Father, we pray that you'd raise up your worship in these days, for it is sweet and blessed for us to worship you together. And we know that this is your command to us, that we should do this very thing. So that we ask and pray that you bless this book in Jesus' precious name. Amen. And so the particular chapter that I'm reading is chapter 31, which is entitled Refusal of Sites. Remember that the disruption had come about in 1843 when Thomas Chalmers and others had led a huge concourse of people out of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland over the issue of the patronage, whereby landowners were able to inflict ministers who would not teach the word of God on congregations, the congregations wanting to be able to appoint their own ministers and be able to choose men who taught them from the word of God. And this was the culmination of what was known as the 10 Years' Conflict. and I have 2 books on this, which I've never had the time to read, but I expect they make very interesting reading. In fact, this book, Annals of the Disruption, does deal with a lot of the material, and some of it is extremely interesting reading about how these men and how the church was prepared for the disruption, how the battle was carried on over so many years, and what happened. But in this chapter, we're talking about how a very substantial proportion of the Church of Scotland came out, suddenly finding themselves, the ministers with nowhere to live, the churches with nowhere to worship, and in a potentially hostile environment in the nation of Scotland at that time. So I read on. I begin reading. In following the history of the disruption times, we now come to those cases of site refusing, which were brought before a committee of the House of Commons. A gratifying change has since taken place in the feelings of our landed proprietors, but while this is cordially acknowledged, we must not forget what is due to the memory of those friends and supporters, many of them men in humble life, who stood true to their conscientious convictions and loyal to their church in the face of trials which it is difficult to think of as having occurred in the times in which we live. It was no wonder that the Free Church should have met with difficulties at the outset. Proprietors who had keenly resisted the disruption movement could not willingly submit to have the churches and manses of the outgoing ministers built on their lands. But in many of these cases, the feeling of hostility soon began to give way. The landed proprietors of Scotland as a class have the most kindly regard for the people on their estates, and though they might be angry with the Free Church, some of them were very angry, yet when they saw their tenants and country neighbours, industrious, intelligent, God-fearing men, meeting for divine service in the open air, exposed to all the hardships of the climate, their better feelings prevailed, and for the most part they made concessions and met the wishes of the people in a frank and generous spirit. Unfortunately, there were some properties on which a different course was followed. Sites were persistently refused, and much painful feeling was called forth. In the Christian Church, when one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. And for many years, at the approach of winter, as each successive Sabbath came round, there was not a stormy wind blew from the heavens, nor a shower of snow fell, that men did not think of their brethren compelled to worship God in the open air among the cold fir woods of Strathspey, or shivering on the bleak uplands of One Head. The pity is that these things cannot be told without referring to the conduct of those proprietors with whom the trials originated. During the first winter, things were left to take their course, and congregations had to bear as best they could the perils of exposure. The second winter, however, was more severe, and when the stormy weather had fairly set in, it was felt that something must be done. Deputations were sent to make inquiries on the spot. At the Assembly of 1845, the subject was taken up in earnest, a committee was named to take charge of the subject, and by a most fortunate choice, Mr. Graham Spears was appointed convener. Connected by birth and marriage with the landed gentry of Scotland, Mr. Spears was known to the public as Sheriff of Midlothian, and still more as a man of ability whose high-toned Christian character and calm courtesy commanded universal respect among all ranks of society. Amidst the delicate and difficult negotiations of that trying time, the Church might well be thankful that the interests of her people were in the hands of one on whom such perfect reliance could be placed. In entering on their work, the first thing done by the committee was to proceed to London and approach the leading site refusers in private in order to offer explanations and, if possible, remove misconceptions. "We had no wish," said Dr. Buchanan, "to brand any man in the face of the public and in the face of Parliament. This well-meant effort almost entirely failed, and a public movement became absolutely necessary. A discussion took place both in the House of Lords and Commons, and the hope was expressed by leading men of all parties that without any specific enactment, sites would be granted through the pressure of public opinion. Little effect, however, was produced by these statements. The leading opponents resolutely held their ground, and at last, on the motion that Mr. Bouverie, MP for the Kilmarnock boroughs, the House of Commons named a committee of inquiry on the 9th of March 1847. It is well known that there is no more searching ordeal through which any such question can be put than a committee of the House of Commons. Certainly on this occasion, the recusant landlords had every reason to be satisfied with the friends who represented them in the course of the inquiry. Sir James Graham especially, with all his great ability and practised skill, proved himself an eager partisan, sifting every part of the evidence with a view to discredit the Free Church and her claims. One great benefit, however, has resulted from this. The evidence presented to the committee, which such an advocate was unable to shake, may now be quoted and relied on with the most implicit confidence, and we shall accordingly freely avail ourselves of it in the following pages. Of the cases which attracted public notice, one of the first was that of Ballater on Deeside, in the neighbourhood of Balmoral, the favourite residence of the Queen, and at that time of Prince Albert. The proprietor of Mr. Farquharson of Monaltree had recently died, and a site had been refused by his trustees, one of whom happened to be a personal friend of Mr. Spears. Availing himself of this circumstance, he wrote on behalf of the people, but was told in reply that however painful it was to refuse any request of his, yet the trustees knew the sentiments of the late Monaltree, and it was their imperative duty to do what they were sure he would have done. The site must be refused, i.e. the site for the new church. This, however, was only the first step. In the village of Ballater there is a public hall which the owners were accustomed to let on hire for meetings of many different kinds, and the congregation had rented it on the usual terms. The trustees, however, were what is called the feudal superiors of the place. They claimed the right to prohibit the use of the hall, went to law before the Sheriff of Aberdeen and got a decision in their favour, closing the door against the members of the Free Church, who were at the same time saddled with the expense of lawsuit. And I note to those who've been following the other books I've read, this 1843 disruption may well have been the forerunner of the 1859 revival that we found in Aberdeen and the surrounds, including on Deeside here. I continue. Driven thus from the village, where every available building was under the power of the trustees, they met during the first winter on an exposed muir in the open air. Afterwards they found partial shelter in a rude sheepcote, which one of the farmers allowed them to occupy. It was 9 feet in breadth, the walls 5 feet high, without windows. The roof, of course, was low, the place dark and comfortless, and the people proposed to heighten the walls and put on a new roof, thinking, in their simplicity, that as this would improve the property at their own expense, no objection would be offered. But the farmers on the Monaltree estate and the trustees at once interposed to forbid the improvement. The congregation had no desire for a second experience of the sheriff court and had to submit. But necessity is the mother of invention. If they could not heighten the roof, might they not get room by lowering the floor? Fortunately, at this point, the trustees drew a line in their favour. Men were set to work, and by burrowing into the ground, a greater space was got overhead between the audience and the rafters. There were, however, certain drawbacks. In rainy weather, the water, which ran from the hillside, could with difficulty be kept out, while the leakage from the roof added to the discomfort. After all, as Dr. Guthrie remarked, divine service had to be carried on while the congregation was sitting in a hole. Ballater, it should be remembered, stands amidst the beautiful scenery of Deeside and is a favourite health resort in the north of Scotland. Among the visitors who came from many different parts of the country, it was a subject of much remark to see the circumstances in which a Christian congregation were compelled to worship God not only in full view of the public, but in the immediate neighbourhood of the Queen and her court. Now, I should note, while I'm reading this, there's some interesting pictures that go with this. There's a picture of the Ballater meeting and the sheepcote that we've been talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scan these in and I'll put them onto the documents here. So if you want to see the pictures, then you can see them in the documents section on my webpage here on Sermon Audio. Further to the north, similar trials were met with on a larger scale in Strathspey, where the property of the Earl of Seafield is described as extending 28 miles in length by 15 in mean breadth. Over this wide district, the adherents of the Free Church were dependent on the will of a single proprietor, but there was every reason to anticipate the kindest treatment at his hands. On his other estates at Cullen and Glen Urquhart, sites had been freely granted, while in Strathspey itself, as Mr. Dixon, banker, a member of the Free Church, testifies, Lord Seafield was very much respected and beloved. No landlord could be more so. Unfortunately, there were evil advisers at hand. A hostile factor got up a petition, as factors well know how, urging that sites should be refused. The signatures were not numerous, 12 in all. One of the witnesses said, "But it is to be regretted that we find among them the names of the established church ministers in the district. one of whom was bold enough to tell the committee of the House of Commons that he did not think he would object to Roman Catholics obtaining sites, but would resist the Free Church to the uttermost. To such councillors Lord Seafield deferred, and all along Strathspey much hardship had to be endured. The parish of Duthil may be taken as an example. The people in large numbers joined the Free Church, and having to worship in the open air, chose as their place of meeting a fir wood near Carbridge, a portion of those grand old pine forests for which Strathspey has so long been famous. A rude pulpit was set up, round which in all weathers the people gathered, often in circumstances painful to witness. Early in the winter of 1844, the Presbytery of the Bounds took an opportunity, during a severe snowstorm, to appeal to Lord Seafield. We cannot believe that it is your lordship's wish to oblige them to continue meeting in the open air at the risk of health and even of life in such weather as the present. It should be remembered that the cold of the northern district is often intense, and that the fir wood of Carbridge lies some 700 feet above the sea level. The adverse influence, however, was too strong, and the appeal was in vain. So there's a picture here of them meeting in a fir wood with a man preaching in a bothy to a large congregation who are, needless to say, very warmly dressed. The pastoral care of all these congregations in Upper Strathspey had devolved on the only outgoing minister, Mr. Shepherd of Kingussie. Often, in going to Duthil, the weather he met with was severe. On the 22nd of November 1846, there was incessant rain during the whole service. During sermon in January 1847, it rained without interruption, and there was high wind. Another visit was yet more remarkable. The service had been announced, but a snowstorm had begun on the previous Saturday, and a message had been sent from the Duthil elders requesting him not to come. It was impossible they could stand it out. Mr. Shepherd had 20 miles to drive, but owing to the scanty supply of preachers, the arrangements once made had to be carried out, and he went to do his duty. It was very stormy, he says, and I had great difficulty in getting from my house to the place. On arriving, about 200 people were found assembled, 1/3 of the usual number, and the first thing was to have the snow cleared away from the pulpit, the precentor's desk, and the seats on which they required to sit. This was trying work, not easy for the people who had to attend on the services, and specially difficult for the officiating minister, who had to drive 40 miles going and returning through the falling snow. While these things were going on in Strathspey, there were similar times of trial in Skye and Uist among the tenantry of Lord MacDonald. To all their petitions, his invariable reply was, "I must positively decline to give a site." And thus over the whole of his extensive estates in Portree, Kilmuir, Slate, Stenschol, Uig, Tremisgary, the people had to submit to severe hardships. The one outgoing minister who remained in Skye to uphold single-handed the cause of the Free Church was the Reverend Roderick MacLeod of Sneesort, a man of rare force of character who has been already referred to in these pages. And just a note, I'm not sure if I didn't do a whole message on him from the Apostles of the North here on this website on Sermon Audio. You can check that out, Roderick MacLeod of Sneesort. I can't quite remember if that was the Roderick MacLeod we did. It would take long to tell the sacrifices and labours which he went through. As at Duthil, the weather in the open air was often trying. At Kilmuir, he speaks of conducting the whole service under very heavy rain. See how motivated the people were to go and worship God together. And at Uig, during sermon, on one occasion it began to snow, the fall being so heavy that at the close, he says, I could hardly distinguish the congregation from the ground on which they sat, except by their faces. It would be difficult anywhere else in all Christendom to find ministers willing to preach and people willing to listen during such a service. At the hamlet of Pable in North Uist, the circumstances are given in greater detail. The people had set about erecting a rude shelter of turf and stone on what was called a common, where the ground was of little value. The factor, after warning them in vain, came personally on the scene, got together the carts belonging to the members of the established church, and removed the materials to a distance. When the next term came, he summoned out of their lands all the crofters who had taken part in the erection, actually ejected some of the more prominent, and imposed fines of from £1 to £2 on those who were suffered to remain. That's quite serious persecution. The poor Islemen, however, did not flinch. In March 1847, when Dr. Mackintosh Mackay came to preach at Pable, he had, owing to the state of the weather, to stand within the door of a cart shed in order to get some protection. The congregation stood all round on a level piece of ground, sheltered by the walls of the houses on one side. It was a stormy day, and there were heavy showers of sleet and rain. Afterwards they met under the shelter of a peculiar jutting rock near the hamlet. I could compare it to nothing but what is sometimes seen on the quarter-deck of a vessel, an oval skylight. In all states of the weather, it was possible to get some shelter by going round to the point opposite to that from which the wind blew. On these estates, however, there were worse things than the storms of winter. The crofters and small farmers, having no leases, were at the mercy of the landlord, and, as the factor admitted, a good many of them were charged to leave because they supported the Free Church. He, the landlord, gave me a list and said, "Here is a list of fellows that must have notice to quit." How many were actually expelled does not appear. I mean, that's their livelihood gone, their homes gone, their families put out. But one or two cases may be given to show how completely his lordship was in earnest. Mr. Donald Matheson was a member of the Free Church at Portree, that's the capital of Skye, the Isle of Skye, because it became a collector for the Sustentation Fund, and referring to the year 1846 states, "I was warned out of the lands which my forefathers had held from immemorial ages." On appealing to the factor, Mr. Mackinnon of Corrie, he was told it had been resolved to remove him from the property. I mean, this is severe persecution. Before submitting, however, he determined to try the effect of a personal interview, and with some difficulty obtained from the factor Lord Macdonald's London address. He at once started for Edinburgh, took the London steamboat, and with a strange mixture of simplicity and shrewdness, recounts his adventures. On landing, the first thing he did was to get into a cab, and directed the man to go straight to the address he had received. For some reason it took them 3 hours driving through the streets before the house could be found, and then it was only to ascertain that his lordship had gone on a visit to Yorkshire. To Yorkshire, accordingly, he followed, and among other incidents he describes the great satisfaction he had at an inn where he stayed in proving to his host, so he thought, the superiority of Highland politeness over that of Englishmen. On arriving in Yorkshire, Mr. Matheson went at once to find Lord Macdonald, but he was not to be seen, having gone out shooting for the day. Next morning no time was lost in making an early call, but he was again disappointed. Lord Macdonald had left for London that morning at 7 o'clock. Nothing daunted, he started again in pursuit, took the coach for London, and next day succeeded in obtaining an interview. It proved, however, the reverse of satisfactory. He wanted to know my name before my admission to his presence. On being introduced, he asked, "What is it you want?" "I wish that your lordship would be pleased to look at my humble petition." He turned round and said in a voice so loud as to make the whole fabric re-echo, "No, no, I am glad Corrie has dealt with you in the way he has done. Away, away," calling on his valet to come and wait on me. I indeed thought that if I was to say a single word, he would use me nothing better than Balaam would his ass. On retiring, Mr. Matheson at once forwarded his petition to Lord Macdonald by post, started for Liverpool, and arrived at home 2 days before the term at which he had to remove. The breaking up of his home was painful. My dear spouse was confined on her deathbed. Through fear of the factor, she had to be removed to very poor and insufficient accommodation, and there she ended her earthly career, and with a sore heart he laid her in the grave. There was no mercy, was there? Here she was on her deathbed, and yet they put her out of the house. And yet they'd been there for generations and generations, more than anybody could have counted. This was severe persecution. Driven from his farm, the energy of the man did not forsake him. He betook himself to business as a shipper and provision merchant, and seems to have prospered. It is strange to observe how it brought him again in contact with those who had tried to get rid of him. A year and 9 months after that visit to London, Lord Macdonald and his factor were standing at the quay at my potato vessel. I went out, and Corrie introduced me politely to his lordship and said, "Lord Macdonald wants some potatoes for seed, and I want some also. But unfortunately we have no money, and maybe your manner of dealing would not allow of giving us credit for 3 months. I said, "You are quite welcome to as many as you want." That's Christian, isn't it? Yeah. Next season, the Inspector of Poor called on Corrie and told him that the merchant who used to supply him with meal for the poor, the parish paupers, would give him no more because he was not yet paid for what they got. Corrie bid him come to me and try if I would supply him for a month. I told him I would supply him for a 12-month without money, but that the amount would have to be paid on that day or they would be put to expense. When the time for payment came, no money was forthcoming. Legal steps were taken. Lord MacDonald and his factor begged for indulgence, but Mr. Matheson was firm. The whole amount with interest and legal expenses was paid, and the intercourse of the nobleman with his former tenant was at an end. That seems to me to be the judgment of God against them. He did show them mercy, but it does seem to me to be the judgment of God upon them and the raising up of the one and the putting down of the other. The case of one of the ministers, the Reverend Norman MacLeod, is not less remarkable. He had been settled at Trumisgarry in North Uist and joined the Free Church in 1843 with nearly the whole Protestant population of the district. His living was one of the so-called parliamentary churches, and there being no manse, he rented from Lord MacDonald a small farm on which, at his own expense, he had built a cottage with 6 fireplaces. After the disruption at the first term, he received notice to quit. I trust he wrote in reply, "Your lordship does not really intend to drive me with my young and helpless family out of my present dwelling house. I am willing to give any rent another will offer, and should your lordship not choose to give the farm on any terms, I would be satisfied with the house and grass for 2 cows and a horse." He mentions also that he had been at considerable expense in improving the farm, from which he had as yet received little or no return. The answer to this question was a peremptory refusal sent through the factor. So this Lord MacDonald and his factor Corrie are obviously men who didn't have any human compassion in them, or that's what it sounds like. I have also to intimate to you that Lieutenant John MacDonald is to get the lands possessed by you, and you should make the best bargain you can with him about the house. It will be against you his not getting a lease of the lands, for as yet Lord MacDonald has only agreed to let him have the place from year to year. The new tenant, holding the place on a tenure so precarious, could not of course give value for the premises. The sum of £40 was all that Mr. MacLeod could obtain for unexhausted improvements and for the house he had built, and he was left to extract what comfort he could from the closing sentence of the factor's letter. I can only again express my regret at the disagreeable situation you are placed in, but hope that you may get well over it. With kind compliments to Mrs. MacLeod, I am... Yes. Okay, I read on. It is incredible that the nobleman and factor intended to take an undue advantage. Their object must simply have been to drive Mr. MacLeod from the island in the hope that the people would return to the established church. But the ministers of the Free Church were not easily driven. The nearest house Mr. MacLeod could get was on the farm of Callan, about 20 miles distance from the scene of his labours. It was in a bad state of repair, and the roads were such that he states, "I cannot take a horse within 3 miles of it." The distances were great, and the weather often so inclement that, with the exception of 1 or 2 occasions, he did not think that he ever reached his congregation and got back to his house without being drenched through, and this even though covered with 6 or 7 ply of as good cloth as the Highlands could produce. In the face of all difficulties, that's Harris Tweed, I'm guessing, good stuff. In the place of all difficulties, however, Mr. MacLeod stood to his post. The time came when a comfortable church and manse were provided, and there, down to the present day, 1881, he remains, after a long ministry, the pastor of an attached flock, while of those who oppressed him, it must be said that their place knows them no more. The island of Egg, one of the smaller Hebrides, was the scene of another of these struggles. There was a Protestant population of about 200 persons, who all joined the Free Church with 3 exceptions: the servant in the established church manse, the ground officer on the estate, and his father, a pauper. The whole island belonged to Professor Macpherson of Aberdeen, who refused a site. Already in these pages we have seen from the vivid description of Hugh Miller how it fared with the people for the church accommodation. But for the outgoing minister, Mr. Swanson, and his family, no house room could be got. If he had chosen to accept a call, he might soon have found a more advantageous position elsewhere, but he had seen among his people the promise of spiritual blessing, and when a call came unsought, he told the assembly that if he might ask a favour, it was that they would leave him where he was. Denied accommodation on the island, the nearest residence he could obtain was at Ornsay in Skye, across many miles of stormy sea. There his family was settled, while his own home was really on the deep. To visit and preach to his people, he procured a small vessel, the Betsy, on board which so much of his time was spent that she came to be spoken of as the floating manse. In the autumn of 1843, when the Assembly met at Glasgow, it was announced that the Minister of Egg was coming up, bringing his manse with him. The idea of seeing her on her way as she came up the Clyde, running before the wind, with the minister at home on board, was sufficiently romantic, but when men went to call at the manse, she was found to be a poor vessel of 12 tons burden, some 30 feet in length by 11 in breadth, utterly unfit to contend with the storms of the Atlantic. Connected with the Betsy, there is a child's story told by Mr. W. Dixon in the Children's Record, which brings back some of the trials of that time. At the removal from the manse of Egg, while the furniture was being packed, Mr. Swanson set sail for Ornsey, taking with him his son, a child 5 years of age. It was a grand thing at first for Billy to go with his father in the ship, but by and by he could not understand his new home. His mother was a-missing, his father had to make the porridge. They had nobody but John Stewart, the sailor, for a servant girl. He tried hard to be manly, but the wind began to blow. Billy got sick and lay down on the cabin floor, crying to be taken home. "My boy," his father said, "you have no home now." "I never so felt the desolateness of my condition," Mr. Swanson declared, "as when the cry of my boy, 'Home, home,' was ringing in my ears." Billy sobbed himself asleep. It is needless to recount the various efforts made to obtain a site. Professor Macpherson said he was afraid of perpetuating religious dissension on the island, an odd objection in a case where the Protestants were virtually unanimous, the only jarring element being that which came from himself at Aberdeen. After the hardship of the first winter, a petition signed by the whole Protestant population was sent applying a second time for a site. Mr. Swanson was on the best terms with a few adherents of the establishment, and with one exception they forwarded a separate application to the effect that Mr. Swanson's health was failing and that they could not bear to see the hardships to which he was subjected. The professor replied that he was sorry to hear of it, but he must do his duty even though it was painful. He was a professor in Old Aberdeen. He must hold the established church, and no site could be granted. Okay, I've got to read on. Meanwhile, Mr. Swanson's life was in danger. The cabin of his vessel was a small place, 12 feet by 6. When closed on account of the weather, it soon got overheated, and to pass out in cold and storm, as he often had to do, to take his place on deck, was a trial which few constitutions with the training of a clergyman could be expected to stand. And there were other dangers. Hugh Miller was his companion for a time, and in his well-known work, The Cruise of the Betsy, has with his own graphic power shown the kind of perils which were met with even during the best months of summer. Dr. Mackintosh Mackay, then of Dunoon, who knew the circumstances well, remarks that, "When one thinks of the vessel which Mr. Swanson had to make his home, an unseaworthy, sorry craft which seamen would style a mere rattletrap, and of the dangers of that coast exposed to the storms of the Atlantic, we may thank God that the history of the Free Church escaped the recording of a tragical story." Another of these cases occurred in the island of Coll, which has belonged from time immemorial to the clan MacLean. One of the chieftains in former days is said to have become a Protestant at a time when the people still adhered to the Roman Catholic Church. He saw no reason why the clan should not believe what the chief believed, and he took energetic measures to enforce his views, driving them before him to the Protestant Church. Protestantism thus came to be known in the island as the religion of the yellow cane, from the colour of the stick which the chief had used to second his arguments whilst actively dealing with the people. Of course, we can't approve of that. In 1843, the island belonged to one of his descendants who resided on another property in Mull, where he took an attitude of keen hostility to the Free Church. It was reserved, however, for the men of Coll to make the landlord feel that times had changed. Though nearly the whole population of the island had joined the Free Church, the chief believed that if proper arguments were addressed to them, and if his personal influence were brought to bear, they would return to the establishment. He engaged a minister in whom he had confidence to accompany him to Coll, sent word fixing a particular Sabbath, and invited his clansmen and dependents, the whole population of the island, to come and meet him. Duly at the appointed time, the chief was on the spot with his champion. The people whom he had called were seen gathered along the roads, but instead of meeting him at the established church, they kept streaming past on their way to the Free Church service in the open air. It was in vain that the chief addressed them, placing himself on the road along which they had to go, reasoning and remonstrating with groups and with individuals, urging them to come and at least give his friend a hearing. Their reply was a respectful but firm refusal. "Ask us anything but this," they said, "and we are ready to comply. We will serve you. We will enlist as soldiers or join the navy if you wish. We will follow you as our fathers followed your fathers in the days of old. We will stand by you to the last. But our consciences are our own, and our religious convictions we cannot surrender." To that resolution they stood firm. Inside the threshold of the established church they could not be got, and yet Dr. Mackay, who narrates the facts, declares that there is a very strong feeling of attachment to Mr. Maclean and his family. They are universally beloved by the people. On the island of Mull there is an extensive parish Torresay, where the incidents of 1843 deserve to be recorded. The people in considerable numbers joined the Free Church and applied to Mr. Campbell, Apostle, the only proprietor on whose lands a suitable site could be got. But unfortunately his feelings against the Free Church were particularly keen. The circumstances and incidents, however, will be best understood from the following narrative by the Reverend J. A. Fletcher of Bothwell. The greater number of the parishioners who adhered to the Free Church lived at the small village of Loch Donhead, about 2.5 miles from the parish church, and here, consequently, the congregation usually met for public worship. But a place of worship in the ordinary sense of the term they had not, for many years subsequent to the disruption. The proprietor of that part of the parish, in other respects a most generous landlord, and an elder in the established church, persistently refused all appeals for a site, though approached respectfully by petition from the people, and by letter from Sheriff Graham Spears, the convener of the church's committee on sites. The people, thus driven to shift as best they could, met ordinarily for worship in a gravel pit, which during spring tides was under high water mark. In this gravel pit a canvas tent was erected, which was seldom sufficient to accommodate all the worshippers who assembled. Indeed, I remember to have seen on more than one occasion the preacher, some neighbouring minister, for not till 1869 did they have a settled minister in the congregation, take up his position at the door of the crowded tent facing outwards, so that the rest of the audience, some seated on stones, some reclining on the heather and bracken which grew in the vicinity of the gravel pit, might hear him to advantage. When the weather was fine, the congregation could meet even in a gravel pit in some degree of comfort. But on the west coast, so proverbial for wind and rain, long spells of fine weather are of course rare, so that the people had often to assemble in circumstances most uncomfortable and in the highest degree unfavourable for the becoming worship of God. I remember having to sit outside the tent along with many others, some of them frail, delicate women, my mother being among the number, during pelting showers of hail. I shall never forget the touching sight of an old man, a Waterloo veteran, who sat not far from me on one occasion. He was sitting on a large rough stone, clad in tartan, his grey locks blown about his face, bonnet in hand, stoutly defying the storm, sternly refraining from what he feared might be the irreverent act of covering his head, even in such circumstances, while engaged in the worship of God. But bad as wind and rain and hail were, this faithful band of worshippers had sometimes to contend with a foe more relentless than any of these, for sometimes the tide rose so high during the worship that preacher and people had not only to quit the tent, but the gravel pit as well, and thus continue the service in spite of all restrictions above high water mark. In connection with these encroachments of the tide, I have often heard a pathetic story which in these days of comfortable and even luxurious places of worship is worth the telling. It was the Communion Sabbath. A large congregation filled the tent and spread themselves over every available seat within the reach of the preacher's voice. The sacrament was dispelled, and the minister was delivering the after-table address, standing as I have already described him, looking outwards to the larger part of the congregation who could not be accommodated in the tent. An eyewitness has often described the scene to me somewhat as follows. I was seated near the minister at the door of the tent, earnestly listening, when by and by my attention was diverted by an unaccountable commotion among those who were seated within the tent. I could not understand the cause of the commotion, which was evidently spreading so that those sitting nearest to me began also to be affected. My feet were stretched out before me, resting not on the ground, but on a stone which supported the head of a plank that did duty as a seat on the occasion. At last I observed the minister looking towards the ground in an uneasy manner, as if he had been seized by the spirit of restlessness that was so disturbing the occupants of the tent. Looking to the ground also, I at once perceived the cause of it all. The tide had crawled up unperceived, and there sat the congregation. Not one left his seat, and there stood the preacher, all ankle-deep in the tide, which had thus stealthily crept up to them, while they were solemnly engaged in the most sacred rite of the church. The preacher drew his address to a close. A short parting psalm was sung, for the spot was on the margin of a shallow, landlocked bay, in which the tide rose slowly. The benediction was pronounced, and the congregation, many of them moved to tears, quietly dispersed to their homes. The tent, as may be easily supposed, could not long withstand the combined attack of the elements, and it soon became useless as a place of worship. After it was destroyed, though, the people still worshipped in the open air when the weather was bored. The weather was bored. Let me just check I haven't turned over 2 pages by mistake. Fine. When the weather was fine. They had to find accommodation during boisterous weather as best they could among the houses of friends to the cause. Among these was the blacksmith of the village, McCain, a devoted free churchman. At one end of his smithy was a wooden shed in which he shod horses when the weather was too inclement to permit of his doing so in the open air. Into this shed the congregation crowded during rough weather. McCain, however, was a tenant at will, and soon he got warning to quit from the proprietor. The impression then was, and still is, among those who remember the circumstances, that McCain was turned out of his home because he gave the use of his wretched shed to the Free Church congregation. My father, who could not be banished at will among others, received the Free Church ministers into his house, and one of my earliest recollections is seeing the English-speaking portion of the congregation worship in our house, while the Gaelic-speaking portion, being by far the larger, had to resort to the barn. The proprietor, this is McCain that's speaking here. This is a quote. The proprietor still resolved to stamp out the Free Church if possible, expressed unmeasured indignation and uttered threats of expulsion at the end of my father's lease. Of course, to neither threats nor indignation did my father pay any heed, but continued, if possible, more zealously than ever to befriend the Free Church ministers and to help the Free Church cause. The upshot is that he is still in the same house, while the estate of Torresay is in the possession of strangers. God's judgments again falling on those who opposed his work. It was hard enough to be worshipping down below high water mark, but on the opposite coast of the mainland at Strontian the congregation had to go further out to sea. The whole district of Ardnamurchan was the property of Sir James Riddle, extending over an area of some 40 miles in length. Many of the people joined the Free Church and forwarded a respectful petition asking for sites. His reply was a refusal, and the people of Strontian had to meet, which they did to the number of about 500 in the open air. At communion seasons and at other times, Mr. MacLean of Tobermory held service on the hillside, often in severe weather, and sometimes when the congregation was very wet. Mr. McRae of Knockbane has preached to them with snow on the ground, and when it was lying snow at the time. At the summer communion, he has had an audience of 2,000 gathered from Strontian and the neighbouring districts. The refusal of sites by the proprietor of 40 miles landed estates was a serious matter, but men at that time were not easily baffled. A floating church was proposed which might be anchored in some sheltered bay near the beach and give accommodation to the people till better days came round. The idea was eagerly taken up, subscriptions were raised, plans carefully drawn out. The vessel was contracted for an expense of £1,400, and much interest was felt as her construction went on in one of the building yards of the Clyde under the skilful superintendence of Robert Brown, Esquire, of Fairley. Then came the launch and the voyage from Greenock to Loch Sunat. At first there was some difficulty as to a proper anchorage for the vessel. Mr. Graham Spears, convener of committee, had at one time served in the Royal Navy, and accompanied by a naval friend, he went down in July 1846 to fix on the site. The best place, safest for the ship and most convenient for the people would have been just under the windows of Sir James Riddle's mansion, but as a matter of good taste another was chosen, 2 miles off, and there, at a point about 150 yards from the shore, the vessel was safely moored. How gladly people left the storm-beaten hillside for this strange Highland church of the sea need not be said. It was a singular spectacle on each returning Sabbath, as the hour of public worship drew near, to see the boats coasting along from north and south, each with its contingent of hearers, while numerous groups could be descried far inland, wending their way down from the hills to where the floating church lay moored. Men speak of it as a stirring scene, when ropes and cables were run out from the beach and the boats were rapidly passed backwards and forwards, conveying the worshippers on board. In winter, the hearers came from a distance of 8 or 9 miles, and in summer from a still wider circuit. In rough weather, it was no slight undertaking to get so many people on board. Even in summer, when all was calm, it was a tedious operation, and not unfrequently darkness was setting in before all were again on shore. The numbers who assembled depended on the reputation of the minister expected to preach, and the people had their own way of testing the esteem in which the clergymen were held. It was found that for every 100 hearers the vessel sank an inch in the water. Nothing, therefore, could be easier than to keep the register. They could tell to an inch the popularity of every minister who came. A depression of 6 inches told that a congregation of 600 had been drawn together, and on some occasions it is said that this number was exceeded. Well now, isn't that interesting? On the whole, it would appear that this plan of church extension, so novel among the Highlanders, was found to answer well. There was only one person whom it did not altogether please. The letters of Sir James Riddle are those of a kind-hearted and friendly landlord, strongly prejudiced against the Free Church. But when he came from the continent and saw what was going on, it was not to his mind. In an interview with Dr. Beath of Stirling, one of his officiating ministers, he expressed a wish to have the iron vessel brought in close to the shore and made fast so as to be more convenient for the people. Dr. Beath, while willing to consider the proposal, suggested that, in agreeing to this, he was readily yielding the whole principle and might as well give a site at once. For that, however, the time had not yet come. Before going further, it may be right to speak of the reasons which induced these landlords, in so many cases, to act so unlike themselves. Their letters of refusal, in some instances, found their way to the newspapers, but it would hardly be fair to quote statements evidently written in haste under the excitement of keen feeling. Their case appears to most advantage as presented by Sir James Graham and their other friends in the Committee on Sites. One allegation was that the Free Church had no real grounds to stand on, and that the disruption was caused by some obscure ecclesiastical opinion of no practical moment, and that the people should just go back to the establishment. To this the answer was obvious. Yes, the people had already voted their feet in huge numbers. That, in the opinion of the Free Church, the question was one of vital moment. Ministers gave up their livings on account of it. Laymen perilled and often lost their situations. There was huge persecution of people at the disruption. And what right had landlords to judge other men's consciences in regard to the importance of their religious principles? It was clear also, even on the showing of their opponents, that the difference was important. Sir James Graham and other statesmen, instead of yielding the point at issue, resolved on account of it to allow the church to be broken up and her ministers to be driven out, after proving in this way their sense of its importance. It was strange to have them turning round and attempting to speak of it as a thing of trifling moment. Okay, because time is getting on, I'm going to skip a bit and I'm going to carry on reading here on page 430. Passing on from these general sentiments, and I do believe that the disruption was a thoroughly Christian thing and was entirely consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'd like to hope if I'd been there in 1843 I would have been part of that. Because I believe that it was to stand for the truth. But anyway, passing on from these general statements, however, we must now refer to certain cases which occurred in the south of Scotland and which unhappily became only too prominent in public view. Canonby is a rural parish in Dumfriesshire. We've come across it before in our studies of the Covenanters. Lying along the English border, the whole land belongs to the Duke of Buccleuch, who is known in Scotland as one of the most fair-minded and kindest of proprietors. With few exceptions, the inhabitants were in His Grace's employment as tenants at will or dependents. At the disruption, the adherents of the Free Church met in the open air for public worship in front of a row of cottages. The numbers were considerable, but before applying for a site, they wished to have the congregation consolidated. A canvas tent was procured from Edinburgh, and relying on the kindly feelings of the landlord, they had it erected on the corner of a moss or moor, where the land was of little value, in the confident expectation that no offence would be taken. For 3 or 4 Sabbaths all went well, but suddenly that formidable engine of law, an interdict, came from the sheriff. The tent was ordered to be removed, and the people, as they believed, were prohibited from meeting on any part of the Duke's lands. At first sight it appeared as if this must be fatal. A solitary case had at last occurred in which the Free Church must be overborne. There was no friendly seashore where they might meet between tide marks, and the far-reaching Buccleuch estates, stretching on either hand, left them no hope of taking refuge on any neighbouring property. There was just one resource left, the open grassy side of the public road where the people might meet to worship God. No tent could be used, as it would have been illegal to dig holes on the roadside for the necessary supports. All that could be done was to select a spot near some trees which on stormy days might serve partially to break the force of the blast. In these circumstances, the congregation met from Sabbath to Sabbath, comprising not only the day labourers and the smaller tenants, but some of the leading farmers in the district. At the approach of the first winter, a petition was got up asking for a site. It was signed by 1,083 persons, and to their credit be it said, fully the half of the names were those of persons belonging to the established church who were anxious to see such a public grievance removed. The petition was duly sent, but to the surprise of many, the receipt of it was not even acknowledged. How the months of winter were got through we shall see. But during the following summer, an incident took place which was not without effect. In the month of July, a rumour spread through the parish that the Reverend Dr. Gordon of the High Church, Edinburgh, himself a Dumfries man, who stood in the foremost rank of Scotland's most honoured clergymen, was coming to dispense the Lord's Supper to that outcast congregation on the wayside. He was to be accompanied by 3 devoted elders, landed proprietors of high social position, Mr. Claude Alexander of Ballochmyle, Mr. Howison Crawford of Crawfordland, and Mr. Adam Rowland of Gask, who were to be joined in the services of the communion by Sir Patrick Maxwell of Sprinkle, an extensive Dumfriesshire landlord. The situation was becoming serious. It would hardly do to treat this intelligence as the Canopy petition had been treated. The factor of the Duke appeared on the scene to say that His Grace would not bear to think that so holy an office should be desecrated by being unnecessarily celebrated by the side of the public highway. So it seems he was getting embarrassed because other people of his rank were getting involved. The use of a field was offered for the purpose, and under the superintendence of the factor, the place was fixed on. A gravel pit was cleared out and levelled, the tent was erected, and all was made ready. When Sabbath morning came and Dr. Gordon and his friends arrived on the ground, they found an audience assembled of at least 1,000 hearers, who had come from all the surrounding parishes. It was vain to think of using a tent. Out on the open field, under the canopy of heaven, the communion tables were spread. The day was bright and pleasant, the services peculiarly solemn and memorable to many for the deep impression which was made and the spiritual benefits which were received. A great point had now been gained. Under the sanction of the factor, the tent had been pitched at the gravel pit. Thankfully, the people, in an address which they sent to the Duke, acknowledged his kindness and were assured in reply that as a temporary arrangement the tent might be allowed to stand, but no site must be expected to be given on his lands. The congregation must disperse. It is touching to see the gratitude of the people for such a concession, and some readers may be ready to think that it was quite as great as the occasion called for. But during the previous winter there had been trials and hardships severe enough to make them sincerely thankful for even such a favour. The Reverend Peter Hope, afterwards settled at Wamprey, brings their trials strikingly before us. And we're thinking about, whether people should be worshipping in the open air today, whether they could in the time of coronavirus lockdown. So it does well to pay attention to this. After the struggle between the Duke and the Free Church was fairly begun, I preached my first sermon in Canonby as a probationer appointed to the post by the Free Church. It was the 19th of November that I first addressed the houseless and shivering congregation. I had preached the year before in the parish church where everything was comfortable, but how different were the circumstances in which I now proclaimed the word of God. It was indeed sad to see old men and women and little children standing exposed on the open road to the wind and rain in this Christian land, and near the middle of the 19th century, listening to no political harangue, but simply to the gospel of Christ. and all because of their having been driven from a barren moor where the wandering gypsies are made welcome to pitch their tents and dwell for weeks together. During the winter we met Sabbath after Sabbath, the length of the service being determined by the state of the weather. The firmness and steadiness of the congregation were truly admirable. The last Sabbath of February was the stormiest of the winter. I had arranged to exchange services with the Reverend Mr. Ross, afterwards settled at Langholm, and early in the morning I rode through the blinding drift of snow to that town in order to fulfil my engagement. But on arriving there, it was found impossible for Mr. Ross to go to Canonby, owing to the tremendous boisterousness of the weather. With great difficulty, I rode back through wind and snow to our usual place of meeting, and found actually between 30 and 40 people assembled. I conducted a short service and sent them home. It was certainly an impressive and solemn sight, that little company of worshippers, their plaids and clothes all white with snow, standing on the highway, listening to the injunction to have the same mind in them which was also in Christ, to render to no man evil for evil, but to overcome evil with good. How sweet it is to worship with the people of God. How important it is. During the month of March, Mr. Guthrie preached at Canonby. The day was wet, windy and cold. During the interval between the service and during almost the whole of the afternoon services, the rain fell in torrents. But it did not prevent a congregation of between 500 and 600 people assembling to hear the striking and impassioned preacher. He was himself deeply impressed with the scene, and he will be sure to give the world a vivid picture of what he saw. I had a good deal of intercourse with Mr. Guthrie during his short visit, and was highly pleased with his curious and fervid conversation. He is a man not merely to dazzle and delight by his free and happy fancy and bold and moving eloquence, but he can also guide by his sagacious counsel and draw everyone to his side by his frank and gladsome spirit and by the kindliness of his heart. Now, usually I would stop at this point because we've been going for 56 minutes, but frankly I think it's so important I'm going to keep going. And also I'm being thrilled by what I'm reading. I'm thrilled just by the sheer determination of people to meet together to worship God. These were people who were being taught the gospel, and ever so many of them would have been true Christians, true followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. So I read on. How vivid was the impression of this scene in his mind? The following description in a letter written at the time will show. On the previous day he had reached Langholm, where he stayed overnight, and the next morning, he says, well wrapped up, I drove out to Canonby. The hills white with snow, the roads covered ankle deep in many places with slush, the wind high and cold, thick rain lashing on, and the Esk by our side, all the way roaring in the snow flood between bank and brae. We passed Johnny Armstrong's tower, yet strong even in its ruins, and after a drive of 4 miles, a turn of the road brought me in view of a sight which was overpowering and would have brought the salt tear into the eyes of any man of common humanity. The person who drove me, when we came in sight of that congregation, burst into tears and asked me, was there ever sight like that? There, under the naked boughs of some spreading oak trees, at the point where a county road joined the turnpike, stood a tent, pulpit, around or rather in front of which was gathered a large group of muffled men and women with some little children, a few sitting, most of them standing, and some old venerable widows cowering under the scanty shelter of an umbrella. On all sides, each road was adding a stream of plaided men and muffled women to the group, till the congregation had increased to between 500 and 600, gathering on the very road and waiting my forthcoming from a mean inn where I found shelter till the hour of worship had come. Now, I should point out, and I know this from personal experience from preaching in snowstorms in Glasgow in the open air, I should point out that these people obviously were warmly dressed on cold days, but we have much better clothing today than we had then. I'm not suggesting that people should be, older people for example, should be exposed to bad weather that could harm them, but we can be a lot tougher, and especially when we have so much at our disposal that we can use to keep warm. And we're going to have more than one umbrella, we can have many umbrellas. During the psalm singing and first prayer, I was in the tent, but finding that I would be uncomfortably confined, I took up my position on a chair in front, having my hat on my head, my Codrington close buttoned up to my throat, and a pair of boots which were wet through with rain ere the service was over. The rain lashed on heavily during the latter part of the sermon, but none budged, and when my hat was off during the last prayer, some man kindly extended an umbrella over my head. I was so interested, so were the people, that our forenoon services continued for about 2 hours. At the close, I felt so much for the people. It was such a sad sight to see old men and women, some children, and 1 or 2 people pale and sickly, and apparently near the grave, all wet and benumbed with the keen wind and cold rain, that I proposed to have no afternoon service, but this met with the universal dissent. He said, no, they'll have an afternoon service. Doesn't matter how cold or how wet they are. They'll have an afternoon service. They want an afternoon service. So we met again at 3 o'clock, and it poured on almost without intermission during the whole service. And that over, shaken cordially by a man and woman's hand, I got into the gig and drove here, Langholm, in time for an evening service, followed through rain from heaven and wet snow on the road by a number of the people. I hope that the Lord will bless the words and, with spiritual grace, make up to the people for their bodily sufferings. When such trials were made public, they naturally awakened considerable feeling, and ministers from a distance came to show their sympathy with the people, especially when the Lord's Supper was dispensed. One of the venerated fathers of the church, Dr. McKellar, speaks of his experience on 2 of these occasions. I will leave it there, because I think we've got the point over. There is probably about 5 more pages to go of the chapter, but I'm going to... No, there's more than that. I'm going to scan in the pictures in this chapter and several of the other pictures in the book, and I'll put them on this sermon audio website in the documents section at the bottom. They're great woodcuts. But I hope this has shown us that in the past people have faced a challenge of where they could worship under difficult times. I'm not suggesting that in a time of lockdown and social distancing, open-air worship would be the same as this, but we have established at least that it's possible to preach in the open air, it's possible to meet in the open air, and when people are motivated to seek the Lord Jesus Christ, then they're willing to endure great hardship in order to be fed from the Word of God. Now, having said that, also, maybe God himself is sending us out into the open air so that we can be salt and light, a city set on the hill, a light, a lampstand in its right place and not hidden under a bed or under a bushel. Who can say what God will do with us if we go out and he uses us in this way? Anyway, I've enjoyed reading that, and thanks be to the Lord.